My name is Elena Castellanos, and 6 months ago, my husband of 15 years stood before a family court judge and declared me mentally unstable, unfit to make decisions about our children or our assets. He spoke with such conviction, such practiced authority, that even I began to question my own sanity. But when I presented my evidence to that same judge 3 weeks ago, the look of horror on her face as she reviewed my documentation made my husband lose his medical license, his reputation, and everything he thought he had secured through his manipulation. The truth, it turns out, has a way of surfacing when you stop accepting other people's definitions of your reality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything began like so many others, in our pristine suburban home in Meadowbrook Heights. Dr. Marcus Castellanos, respected cardiothoracic surgeon and pillar of the community, stood in our marble-appointed kitchen reviewing his schedule while I prepared breakfast for our twin daughters Sophia and Isabella. To any observer, we appeared to be the embodiment of professional success and family stability. Our home featured prominently in the annual charity home tour. Our daughters attended the most prestigious private academy in the region. My husband's surgical innovations had earned him recognition in medical journals and speaking engagements at international conferences. What those observers could not see was the systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that had been carefully constructed over more than a decade to convince me, our social circle, and eventually the legal system that I was an unstable woman whose perceptions of reality could not be trusted. The architecture of this manipulation was so sophisticated, so gradually implemented, that I had not recognized it as intentional until the moment when Marcus's efforts to have me declared mentally incompetent threatened to separate me permanently from our children. Only then did I begin to understand that what I had interpreted as concern for my well-being was actually a calculated strategy to maintain complete control over our family's resources and decisions, while positioning himself as the long-suffering husband of a troubled woman. Marcus had perfected the art of presenting himself as the rational, concerned spouse whose dedication to his family required him to manage his wife's episodes with medical expertise and infinite patience. In public settings, he would place a protective hand on my shoulder while explaining to concerned friends that the stress of raising twins while managing our household had created anxiety issues that sometimes manifested in confusion or erratic behavior. These performances were masterful in their subtlety. Marcus would never directly contradict my statements in social situations. Instead, he would offer gentle corrections delivered with the authority of medical training and the tone of loving concern. When I mentioned plans we had discussed for renovating our guest quarters, he would smile sadly and explain to our friends that I had been experiencing memory issues lately, forgetting conversations or conflating discussions we had considered but ultimately decided against. When I expressed opinions about our daughters, educational needs, or extracurricular activities, Marcus would nod supportively while quietly informing other parents that the pressure of maintaining our family's standards had created emotional instability that sometimes led to unrealistic expectations or inconsistent decision-making regarding the children's welfare. The genius of his approach lay in its plausibility and his credibility. Marcus was indeed a brilliant surgeon, whose professional competence was unquestioned by colleagues and patients alike. His reputation for calm decision-making under pressure, combined with his extensive medical knowledge, made his assessments of my psychological state seem both informed and trustworthy to those who observed our interactions. More insidiously, he had created a feedback loop that reinforced his narrative while undermining my confidence in my own perceptions. When I would question his version of events or challenge his characterizations of my behavior, he would respond with expressions of deep concern about my increasingly paranoid thinking patterns and my growing tendency to interpret his support as somehow threatening or controlling. These conversations would typically conclude with Marcus scheduling appointments with psychiatrists or therapists, whom he had selected based on their willingness to accept his preliminary assessments of my condition. These professionals, presented with Marcus's detailed documentation of my alleged symptoms and his medical credentials supporting his observations, would often begin treatment relationships with predetermined conclusions about the nature and severity of my psychological issues. The therapeutic process became another mechanism for reinforcing Marcus's narrative rather than providing genuine support for whatever legitimate stress I was experiencing as the result of his manipulation. Sessions would focus on helping me develop better coping strategies for managing my anxiety and improving my ability to distinguish between accurate perceptions and distorted thinking patterns that were causing conflict in our marriage. Meanwhile, Marcus was systematically positioning himself as the primary decision-maker for all aspects of our family life, while creating documentation that would support his eventual petition to the court for legal authority over our assets and custody arrangements. He had begun consulting with attorneys who specialized in cases involving mentally incompetent spouses, building a legal strategy that would formalize his control while protecting him from any potential challenges to his financial management or parenting decisions. The most devastating aspect of this manipulation was how it had affected my relationship with Sophia and Isabella. Marcus had gradually trained our daughters to monitor my behavior for signs of the instability he had described, encouraging them to report to him when mommy seemed confused, or when I made statements that contradicted information they had received from him about family plans or household rules. Our daughters, who were naturally concerned about their mother's well-being and trusted their father's medical expertise, began to view me through the lens of Marcus's narrative. They would exchange worried glances when I would attempt to discuss family decisions or express opinions that differed from what their father had told them to expect. Their growing distance from me and increasing reliance on Marcus for guidance about household matters served as additional evidence for his claims about my deteriorating mental state and diminished capacity for effective parenting. The social isolation that resulted from this systematic undermining of my credibility had profound effects on my psychological and emotional well-being. Friends who had once sought my advice about their own family challenges began to treat me with the careful politeness reserved for individuals whose judgment cannot be fully trusted. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent, and when I did attend community events, conversations would often shift toward topics that did not require my input or opinions. This isolation reinforced Marcus's narrative, while depriving me of the external perspectives and support systems that might have helped me recognize the manipulation occurring within our household. The few attempts I made to discuss my concerns with friends or family members were interpreted through the framework Marcus had established, leading to gentle suggestions that I might benefit from additional therapeutic support rather than validation of my perceptions. The financial dimensions of Marcus's strategy were particularly sophisticated, involving the gradual transfer of decision-making authority over our investments, real estate holdings, and business interests to arrangements that minimized my access and influence while maximizing his control. These changes were presented as protective measures designed to reduce the stress on me that came from managing complex financial matters during a period of psychological vulnerability. Marcus had retained financial advisors and accountants who supported his narrative about the need to shield me from decisions that might exacerbate my anxiety, while ensuring that our family's assets were managed by individuals with the expertise and emotional stability necessary for sound financial stewardship. The documentation supporting these arrangements included detailed reports from the medical and therapeutic professionals who had treated me based on Marcus's initial assessments and ongoing observations of my behavior. As the date approached for the custody hearing that would determine our daughters, living arrangements, and my legal status regarding family decisions, I found myself in a position that seemed hopeless by every conventional measure. Marcus had spent years building a comprehensive case for my mental incompetence that included medical records, therapeutic assessments, financial documentation, and testimony from community members who had observed my alleged deterioration over time. The legal representation Marcus had provided for me was carefully selected based on their willingness to work within the framework he had established, rather than challenging the fundamental premises of his petition. My attorney had advised me that contesting Marcus's characterizations of my mental state would likely be counterproductive, given the extensive documentation supporting his position and his credibility as a medical professional. However, during the months leading up to the custody hearing, I had been conducting my own investigation into the patterns I was beginning to recognize in Marcus's behavior and the systematic nature of the manipulation I had experienced. This investigation would ultimately provide the evidence that would completely reverse the dynamics of our legal proceedings and exposed the calculated campaign that had been waged against my sanity and autonomy. The documentation I had been secretly gathering included audio recordings of conversations where Marcus had explicitly acknowledged his manipulation strategies, financial records that revealed the extent of his asset transfers without my knowledge, and correspondence with medical professionals that showed his direct influence over their treatment approaches and diagnostic conclusions. More significantly, I had discovered that I was not the first woman Marcus had subjected to this treatment pattern. Through careful research into his professional and personal history, I had identified 2 previous relationships where similar manipulation tactics had been employed to discredit partners who had questioned his control or threatened his professional reputation. The evidence I had assembled painted a picture of calculated psychological abuse that had been refined over years of practice and implemented with the systematic approach that Marcus applied to his most complex surgical procedures. The documentation revealed a man who had weaponized his medical expertise and professional reputation to maintain absolute control over his personal relationships, while positioning himself as the victim of others. Mental instability. As I prepared for the custody hearing that would determine whether Marcus's campaign of manipulation would achieve its ultimate objective, I understood that I was not merely fighting for custody of my daughters or control of our assets. I was fighting to reclaim my identity and demonstrate that the capacity for clear thinking and sound judgment that had been systematically undermined could be restored through courage, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The morning of the hearing, as I reviewed the evidence that would expose Marcus's manipulation and reveal the calculated nature of his campaign against my sanity, I realized that my transformation from victim to advocate had equipped me with insights and strength that I had never possessed before experiencing his systematic attempt to erase my agency and autonomy. The woman who would walk into that courtroom was fundamentally different from the woman who had accepted Marcus's characterizations of her mental state and allowed others to make decisions about her capacity and competence. The evidence in my possession would not only vindicate my perceptions but would also demonstrate the sophisticated nature of psychological manipulation and the devastating effects it can have on individuals who are targeted by those who possess professional credibility and social authority. The judge's reaction to my documentation would prove that truth possesses a power that manipulation cannot ultimately overcome, and that courage, combined with careful preparation, can expose even the most sophisticated campaigns of deception and control. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how I found the resilience to endure 15 years of systematic psychological manipulation while secretly building the case that would ultimately expose my husband's calculated campaign against my sanity, you must know about the woman who shaped my understanding of what it means to persist in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. My grandmother, Isabella Morales, was a woman who understood that survival sometimes requires the ability to appear vulnerable, while quietly accumulating the strength necessary to overcome those who underestimate your capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action. Isabella had immigrated to this country as a young widow with 3 children and no formal education, carrying nothing but an unshakable conviction that intelligence and determination could overcome any systematic attempt to diminish her worth or limit her possibilities. She spoke fragmented English and possessed no professional credentials that would command respect from the established institutions she encountered, but she carried within herself something far more valuable: the understanding that true strength often develops in individuals who are forced to navigate hostile environments without external support or recognition. Her first employment involved cleaning office buildings during overnight shifts, work that most people viewed as temporary necessity, while searching for opportunities that offered greater dignity and financial stability. But Isabella approached her custodial responsibilities with the same strategic intensity that others might bring to executive positions. She studied the organization she served, learned about their operational challenges, observed their decision-making processes, and gradually positioned herself as an indispensable resource for solving problems that others had failed to address effectively. Within 18 months, she was managing entire cleaning operations for multiple corporate clients. Within 3 years, she had established her own service company that employed dozens of workers and maintained contracts with some of the region's most prestigious business establishments. By the time I was born, Isabella owned commercial real estate, had invested successfully in various business ventures, and was recognized throughout our community as a woman whose judgment and integrity could be trusted completely. But Isabella's most significant achievement was not financial success or business recognition. Her greatest accomplishment was developing systems for identifying and responding to individuals who attempted to manipulate or control others through psychological intimidation, professional authority, or social pressure. She had learned to recognize the patterns that characterize predatory behavior long before such concepts were widely understood or discussed in mainstream psychological literature. During my childhood, Isabella would often share stories about encounters with individuals who had attempted to exploit her perceived vulnerabilities or dismiss her concerns based on assumptions about her education, background, or capacity for understanding complex situations. These stories were not presented as complaints or expressions of victimization, but rather as educational examples that illustrated the importance of developing internal strength and strategic awareness that could not be undermined by external circumstances or other people's opinions. Isabella taught me that manipulation tactics follow predictable patterns regardless of the specific context in which they are employed. Individuals who seek to control others through psychological pressure typically begin by establishing themselves as authorities whose expertise or position grants them special insight into what constitutes appropriate behavior or sound decision-making. They then systematically undermine their targets' confidence in their own perceptions while positioning themselves as the reliable source of truth and guidance that can restore stability and clarity. These lessons proved invaluable when I began to recognize similar patterns in my relationship with Marcus, though the sophistication of his approach and his professional credentials initially made his manipulation more difficult to identify than the crude intimidation tactics Isabella had encountered during her early years in this country. Marcus's medical expertise and social status provided him with credibility that made his assessments of my psychological state seem both authoritative and caring to external observers who lacked the context necessary for recognizing the calculated nature of his behavior. Isabella had also taught me the importance of documentation in situations where your word might be challenged by individuals who possess greater social authority or professional credibility than you do. She maintained meticulous records of all business transactions, personal interactions with potential adversaries, and any situations where her integrity or competence had been questioned by others. These records served not only as protection against false accusations, but also as evidence that could support her position when conflicts required resolution through formal processes. The habit of careful documentation that Isabella instilled in me would prove crucial when I finally recognized the extent of Marcus's manipulation and began building the case that would expose his systematic campaign against my sanity and autonomy. The recordings, financial records, and correspondence that ultimately vindicated my position were collected using methods Isabella had taught me for protecting myself against individuals who might attempt to rewrite history or mischaracterize my actions and motivations. Perhaps most importantly, Isabella had demonstrated through her own example that apparent powerlessness could be transformed into strategic advantage when approached with patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to truth. She had allowed others to underestimate her capabilities while quietly developing the knowledge and resources necessary to achieve objectives that seemed impossible given her starting circumstances. During the years when Marcus was constructing his narrative about my mental instability, I often remembered Isabella's advice about the importance of maintaining perspective during periods when external circumstances seemed to confirm other people's negative assessments of your character or capabilities. She had taught me that temporary setbacks or challenges should be evaluated based on their long-term implications rather than their immediate emotional impact, and that strategic thinking required the ability to distinguish between appearances and underlying realities. This perspective proved essential during the numerous occasions when Marcus's manipulation tactics succeeded in convincing others that his concerns about my psychological state were legitimate and warranted. Rather than allowing these incidents to confirm my self-doubt or validate his characterizations of my mental capacity, I learned to view them as additional evidence of the systematic nature of his campaign and the sophistication of his deception strategies. Isabella's influence also shaped my understanding of the relationship between individual strength and community support. She had built her business success through careful cultivation of relationships with individuals who shared her values of integrity, hard work, and mutual respect. These relationships provided her with both emotional support during challenging periods and practical assistance when she needed to address threats to her business interests or personal welfare. However, Isabella had also taught me to recognize that building genuine support networks requires the ability to distinguish between individuals who offer authentic friendship and those who provide conditional acceptance based on their perception of your status, resources, or usefulness to their own objectives. This discernment proved crucial, as Marcus's manipulation campaign gradually isolated me from friends and family members who might have provided alternative perspectives on his behavior or support for challenging his narrative. The systematic nature of this isolation became clear to me only after I began applying Isabella's analytical frameworks to my own situation. Marcus had carefully identified individuals in our social circle whose opinions carried weight with other community members and had gradually influenced their perceptions of my psychological stability through subtle comments, concerned observations, and requests for their assistance in monitoring my behavior for signs of deterioration. These individuals genuinely believed they were helping both Marcus and me by accepting his assessment of my condition and supporting his efforts to manage my alleged symptoms while protecting our family from the consequences of my instability. Their good intentions made them effective allies in his manipulation campaign, while shielding him from accusations that he was deliberately undermining my credibility or isolating me from potential sources of support. Isabella's teachings about the importance of maintaining strategic perspective during periods of apparent defeat enabled me to recognize that this isolation, while painful, also created opportunities for conducting the investigation that would ultimately expose Marcus's deception. The reduced social contact meant fewer opportunities for him to monitor my activities or influence others' interpretations of my behavior, giving me the privacy necessary for gathering evidence without alerting him to my growing awareness of his manipulation tactics. The financial lessons Isabella had taught me also proved invaluable as I began to understand the extent of Marcus's asset transfers and his systematic exclusion of me from major financial decisions affecting our family's security and future. Isabella had always maintained independent access to financial resources and had taught me the importance of understanding all aspects of household finances regardless of whether day-to-day management responsibilities were shared between spouses. This knowledge enabled me to recognize when Marcus began redirecting our assets into accounts and investments that minimized my access while maximizing his control. More importantly, it provided me with the understanding necessary for documenting these transfers and analyzing their strategic purpose within his broader campaign to establish legal authority over our financial affairs. The business principles Isabella had demonstrated throughout her career also influenced my approach to building the case that would expose Marcus's manipulation. She had taught me that successful challenges to established authority require thorough preparation, irrefutable evidence, and strategic timing that maximizes the impact of your revelations, while minimizing opportunities for your opponents to mount effective counterattacks. These principles guided my evidence-gathering process and helped me understand when sufficient documentation had been assembled to support a comprehensive challenge to Marcus's narrative about my mental instability. Isabella's example also provided me with the emotional strength necessary for enduring the period of apparent vulnerability that preceded my public exposure of his deception campaign. During the most difficult phases of Marcus's manipulation, when even I began to question my own perceptions and wonder whether his characterizations of my psychological state might contain elements of truth, Isabella's teachings about the nature of strength and resilience provided an anchor that prevented me from completely accepting his version of reality. Her example demonstrated that individuals who survive systematic attempts at psychological control possess inner resources that cannot be diminished by external pressure or social isolation. The spiritual dimensions of Isabella's strength also influenced my ability to maintain hope during periods when Marcus's campaign seemed likely to succeed in separating me from our daughters and establishing permanent legal authority over my life decisions. Isabella had possessed deep faith in the ultimate triumph of truth over deception, and in the existence of moral forces that support individuals who persist in fighting against injustice, despite overwhelming odds. This faith provided me with the motivation necessary for continuing my investigation and evidence gathering, even when the emotional cost seemed unbearable and the likelihood of success appeared minimal. Isabella's example had shown me that meaningful victories often require extended periods of apparent defeat, and that individuals who surrender their efforts prematurely may never discover how close they were to achieving their objectives. As the custody hearing approached and I prepared to present evidence that would expose Marcus's systematic manipulation, I carried with me not only the specific strategies and principles Isabella had taught me, but also the profound understanding that personal transformation often emerges from circumstances that initially appeared designed to destroy, rather than strengthen character. The woman who would walk into that courtroom possessed capabilities that had been developed through years of adversity and challenge, rather than comfort and external validation. Isabella's influence had prepared me not only for the tactical aspects of confronting Marcus's deception, but also for the psychological and emotional demands of reclaiming my identity and authority after years of systematic undermining. The evidence I had assembled honored Isabella's legacy, while extending her principles into circumstances she could never have imagined. Her teachings about documentation, strategic thinking, and the patient accumulation of strength would prove their worth in a context that demonstrated how traditional manipulation tactics could be adapted and refined through professional expertise and social authority. The foundation Isabella had provided would support not only my personal vindication, but also my transformation into an advocate for other individuals who had experienced similar systematic attempts at psychological control and manipulation. Her example had shown me that survival was only the first step in a process that could ultimately lead to meaningful protection and support for others facing comparable challenges. The strength I had inherited from Isabella would prove sufficient not only for exposing Marcus's deception, but also for rebuilding my life and relationships in ways that honored both her legacy and the hard-won wisdom that emerged from my own journey through manipulation toward truth and justice. The environment where I began to understand the true nature of Marcus's manipulation was our own home, a magnificent colonial estate in the prestigious Meadowbrook Heights neighborhood that served as both sanctuary and stage for a carefully orchestrated performance designed to convince the world of my mental instability. Within these walls, where family photographs displayed our apparent happiness and success, Marcus had constructed an elaborate theater of deception that would have impressed professional psychologists with its sophistication and systematic approach to undermining another person's sense of reality. Our home was a testament to Marcus's professional success and social standing. The mahogany-paneled study where he conducted important phone calls with colleagues displayed his medical degrees and professional awards prominently. The marble-appointed kitchen where I prepared meals for charity events showcased our commitment to community service. The elegantly furnished living areas where we hosted dinner parties for other prominent families demonstrated our position within the social hierarchy that governed our community's cultural and business relationships. However, this same environment that projected success and stability to external observers had been transformed into a laboratory for psychological manipulation that operated with the precision and methodical approach that Marcus applied to his most complex surgical procedures. Every room contained elements designed to support his narrative about my deteriorating mental state, while providing him with opportunities to document behavior that could be interpreted as evidence of instability or impaired judgment. The master bedroom, which should have been a private refuge where honest communication could occur between spouses, had become a space where Marcus would conduct informal psychological assessments disguised as concerned conversations about my well-being. He would initiate these discussions during moments when I was tired or stressed, carefully steering the conversations toward topics that might elicit emotional responses he could later characterize as disproportionate or irrational. Marcus had developed sophisticated techniques for creating situations that would produce the behavioral evidence he needed to support his narrative. He would deliberately provide me with conflicting information about family schedules or social commitments, then express concerned surprise when I became confused about arrangements or appeared disorganized in my attempts to manage competing obligations. These manufactured incidents of apparent confusion would then be documented in the journal he maintained about my psychological symptoms and shared with the medical professionals who were treating me based on his preliminary assessments. The kitchen, where I spent considerable time preparing meals and managing household operations, became another venue for Marcus's manipulation strategies. He would move items from their usual locations and then express worried observations about my apparent forgetfulness when I searched for utensils or ingredients. He would make verbal commitments to attend family events or school activities, then deny having made such promises while suggesting that my insistence on arrangements we had never actually discussed might indicate memory problems or wishful thinking that was becoming difficult to distinguish from actual conversations. These incidents were particularly insidious because they occurred during routine domestic activities that provided numerous opportunities for creating confusion without obvious external cause. Marcus's medical expertise allowed him to frame these manufactured episodes as symptoms of stress-related cognitive decline that required professional attention and might indicate more serious underlying psychological conditions if left untreated. The formal dining room where we entertained guests became a stage for public demonstrations of Marcus's patient management of my alleged difficulties. During dinner parties with colleagues or friends, Marcus would gently correct statements I made about our family plans or redirect conversations when he determined that my contributions were becoming inappropriate or potentially embarrassing. These interventions were delivered with such subtle professionalism that guests typically perceived them as evidence of his loving concern rather than recognition of systematic undermining. Marcus had perfected the art of creating doubt about my reliability without directly contradicting me in ways that might appear overtly controlling or disrespectful. Instead, he would allow me to complete statements or share information, then provide additional context that subtly modified the meaning of what I had said, while positioning himself as the more authoritative source of accurate information about our family circumstances. The living room, where our daughters completed homework and we conducted family meetings about household decisions, became another environment where Marcus implemented strategies designed to undermine my parental authority while strengthening his position as the primary decision-maker whose judgment could be trusted completely. He would encourage Sophia and Isabella to bring questions about school projects or social activities to him rather than me, explaining that their mother was experiencing stress-related concentration problems that made it difficult for her to provide consistent guidance about academic or social matters. These redirections were presented as temporary measures designed to reduce pressure on me during a difficult period rather than permanent changes in our family's decision-making structure. However, the cumulative effect was to establish Marcus as the reliable parent whose advice and approval carried greater weight than mine in matters affecting our daughters' education, friendships, and extracurricular activities. The home office where I had previously managed our family's financial affairs and community volunteer commitments became a space where Marcus gradually assumed responsibilities that had formerly been mine, explaining to concerned friends and family members that the complexity of our financial situation and social obligations had become overwhelming for me during this period of psychological vulnerability. Marcus would express appreciation for my previous contributions to household management, while explaining that his medical expertise had helped him recognize signs of cognitive overload that might not be apparent to individuals without professional training in stress-related psychological symptoms. This transition of responsibilities was presented as a caring response to my needs rather than a strategic transfer of authority that would support his eventual legal petition for control over our assets and family decisions. The basement recreation room where our daughters spent time with friends became another venue for Marcus's documentation efforts. He would monitor my interactions with visiting children and their parents, noting instances where my behavior might be interpreted as inappropriate social boundaries, excessive emotional responses to minor conflicts, or confusion about arrangements that had been made for playdates or activities. These observations were particularly valuable for his case because they involved witnesses outside our immediate family who might be called upon to testify about their concerns regarding my fitness as a parent and my ability to maintain appropriate relationships with other adults in our community. Marcus was careful to ensure that these witnesses genuinely believed they were protecting our family's welfare by supporting his efforts to address my psychological problems before they created more serious difficulties. The upstairs hallway outside our daughters' bedrooms became a location where Marcus would conduct whispered conversations with Sophia and Isabella about their observations of my behavior and their concerns about changes they had noticed in my emotional responses or decision-making patterns. These conversations were presented as opportunities for the girls to share worries about their mother's well-being with their father, whose medical expertise qualified him to assess whether their concerns indicated problems that required professional attention. Marcus taught our daughters to view certain behaviors as warning signs that should be reported to him for evaluation. If I seemed frustrated with household responsibilities, this might indicate that stress was becoming unmanageable. If I questioned his decisions about family matters, this could suggest that I was developing paranoid thinking patterns. If I appeared tired or distracted during conversations, this might reflect cognitive problems that were affecting my ability to process information accurately. The garage, which housed Marcus's luxury vehicles and served as storage for household equipment and seasonal items, became another space where he would create evidence of my alleged disorganization and poor judgment. He would rearrange storage systems I had established, then document my confusion when I could not locate items, or my frustration when organizational methods I had implemented no longer functioned effectively. These incidents were particularly useful because they suggested that my difficulties extended beyond interpersonal relationships or emotional regulation to include practical problems with memory, planning, and basic household management skills that any competent adult should be able to maintain consistently. The garden areas where I had previously maintained flower beds and vegetable plots became symbols of my declining ability to follow through on commitments or maintain consistent standards of care for living things that depended on my attention and nurturing. Marcus would subtly sabotage my gardening efforts by adjusting watering systems or applying treatments that would damage plants, then express concerned observations about my apparent loss of interest in activities that had previously brought me satisfaction and success. The attic storage areas where we kept family photographs, important documents, and sentimental items became locations where Marcus would relocate or remove objects that had significance for me, then express worried surprise when I searched for missing items, or became distressed about their apparent disappearance. These incidents were interpreted as evidence that I was becoming confused about the location of important belongings or developing unrealistic expectations about what items we still possessed. Throughout this systematic campaign, Marcus maintained detailed documentation of every incident, conversation, and behavioral observation that supported his narrative about my psychological decline. This documentation was shared with the medical professionals who were treating me, providing them with comprehensive evidence that reinforced their diagnostic impressions and treatment recommendations. The sophistication of this environmental manipulation was extraordinary in its attention to detail and strategic implementation. Marcus had transformed our home from a place of comfort and security into a carefully controlled laboratory where every interaction could be monitored, every response could be evaluated, and every emotional reaction could be interpreted as additional evidence, supporting his predetermined conclusions about my mental state. However, this same environment that Marcus had designed to support his manipulation campaign would eventually become the source of evidence that exposed his deception. The systematic nature of his behavior patterns became recognizable once I began applying Isabella's analytical frameworks to my observations of his techniques and strategies. The home that had been transformed into a theater of deception would ultimately provide the setting where I gathered the recordings, documented the incidents, and compiled the evidence that would demonstrate the calculated nature of his manipulation campaign. The very sophistication that made his techniques initially successful would eventually reveal their artificial nature when examined by individuals who possessed the expertise necessary for recognizing psychological abuse and manipulation tactics. The environment that had been designed to convince the world of my instability would become the foundation for demonstrating the systematic nature of Marcus's deception and the extraordinary lengths to which he had gone to maintain control over our family, while positioning himself as the victim of circumstances created by my alleged psychological problems. Every room that had served as a stage for his performance would become a source of evidence that revealed the calculated nature of his campaign and the professional expertise he had applied to undermining my credibility and autonomy. The theater of deception would ultimately become the courtroom where truth would triumph over manipulation and justice would be served, despite the sophistication of the lies that had been constructed to prevent its emergence. While Marcus believed he was successfully dismantling my credibility and establishing absolute control over our family dynamics, I was secretly conducting the most comprehensive education of my life. The systematic nature of his manipulation, which was designed to convince others of my mental instability, inadvertently provided me with an advanced curriculum in psychological abuse tactics, legal documentation requirements, and the sophisticated methods that predatory individuals employ to maintain dominance over their victims while appearing to be caring and concerned partners. My education began during the long hours I spent alone in our home while Marcus was at the hospital performing surgeries or attending medical conferences. These periods of isolation, which he had engineered to limit my social interactions and reduce opportunities for external validation of my perceptions, became precious intervals of clarity where I could analyze his behavior patterns without the constant pressure of his manipulative presence. The first subject I mastered was the recognition of gaslighting techniques and their systematic implementation in domestic relationships. Using the computer in our home office during Marcus's absence, I researched psychological manipulation strategies and discovered that his behavior followed established patterns that had been documented extensively in clinical literature about emotional abuse and coercive control. I learned that gaslighting involves the deliberate distortion of reality to make victims question their own perceptions, memories, and judgment. The perpetrator systematically contradicts the victim's experiences while presenting alternative versions of events that position themselves as the reliable narrator, whose version of reality should be accepted without question. Over time, victims lose confidence in their ability to accurately assess situations and become increasingly dependent on their manipulator for guidance about what constitutes appropriate thinking and behavior. This academic understanding provided me with a framework for analyzing Marcus's techniques and recognizing the calculated nature of incidents I had previously interpreted as genuine concerns about my well-being. The medical consultations he had arranged, the therapeutic interventions he had recommended, and the social adjustments he had implemented were not responses to actual problems with my mental health, but rather components of a comprehensive campaign designed to establish his narrative about my instability, while positioning himself as the rational partner whose judgment could be trusted completely. The second area of my education focused on the legal requirements for documenting psychological abuse, and the types of evidence that courts would consider credible when evaluating claims about systematic manipulation. I discovered that successful challenges to gaslighting campaigns required comprehensive documentation that demonstrated patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents, along with evidence that the alleged abuse was intentional rather than the result of misunderstandings or legitimate concerns. This research revealed that audio recordings of conversations where manipulative tactics were explicitly acknowledged would be particularly valuable, as they provided direct evidence of intent that could not be dismissed as misinterpretation or selective memory. I also learned that financial records showing unauthorized asset transfers or deliberate exclusion from important decisions could demonstrate the broader scope of control that psychological abusers typically seek to establish over their victims. Armed with this knowledge, I began developing strategies for gathering evidence without alerting Marcus to my growing awareness of his manipulation techniques. The sophisticated surveillance capabilities of modern smartphones provided me with tools for recording conversations that would capture his acknowledgement of his deception strategies while appearing to participate in normal domestic interactions. The third component of my education involved understanding the professional and social networks that Marcus had cultivated to support his narrative about my mental instability. I studied the backgrounds and professional relationships of the psychiatrists and therapists he had selected for my treatment, discovering that several of them had previous working relationships with Marcus that created potential conflicts of interest in their assessment of my psychological condition. I learned that one of the psychiatrists Marcus had recommended had collaborated with him on research projects related to stress-induced cognitive decline in medical families. Another therapist had provided expert testimony in custody cases involving allegations of parental mental incompetence, consistently supporting the positions of medical professionals who claimed their spouses were unfit for shared decision-making responsibilities. This research revealed that Marcus had not randomly selected mental health professionals for my treatment, but had instead carefully chosen individuals whose professional relationships with him and philosophical approaches to family psychology would predispose them to accept his preliminary assessments and recommendations for managing my alleged symptoms. The fourth area of my secret education involved developing expertise in financial analysis and asset protection strategies, that would enable me to understand the full scope of Marcus's control over our family resources. Using online courses and professional development materials, I learned to analyze investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and business interests in ways that would reveal unauthorized transactions and systematic exclusion from important financial decisions. This education proved crucial when I began examining our family's financial records and discovered the extent to which Marcus had restructured our assets to minimize my access and maximize his control. The documentation I gathered during this analysis would eventually provide compelling evidence that his claims about protecting me from financial stress were actually mechanisms for ensuring his complete authority over resources that should have been managed jointly. The fifth component of my hidden curriculum focused on understanding the professional standards and ethical requirements that governed Marcus's medical practice, particularly regarding conflicts of interest and the appropriate boundaries between professional expertise and personal relationships. I studied medical ethics guidelines and discovered that his use of professional relationships to influence my psychiatric treatment violated several ethical principles regarding patient autonomy and informed consent. This research revealed that Marcus had leveraged his professional reputation and medical expertise in ways that exceeded appropriate boundaries, essentially practicing medicine on his own spouse through proxy relationships with other healthcare providers who were relying on his clinical assessments, rather than conducting independent evaluations of my psychological condition. The sixth area of study involved learning about the legal processes associated with custody disputes and competency determinations, including the types of evidence that courts typically considered when evaluating claims about parental fitness and decision-making capacity. I discovered that judges were generally skeptical of allegations that appeared to be motivated by relationship conflicts rather than genuine concerns about child welfare, but that systematic documentation of problematic behavior could overcome this skepticism when the evidence was comprehensive and credible. This legal education helped me understand that successfully challenging Marcus's petition for custody and financial control would require more than demonstrating that his claims about my mental state were exaggerated or unfounded. I would need to prove that his allegations were deliberately false, and that his actions constituted a systematic campaign of psychological abuse designed to gain legal authority over our family while damaging my reputation and relationship with our daughters. The seventh component of my education involved developing skills in investigative research that would enable me to uncover information about Marcus's previous relationships and professional conduct that might reveal patterns of manipulative behavior extending beyond our marriage. Using public records, professional databases, and social media research techniques, I began investigating his personal and professional history for evidence that might support my claims about his character and methods. This investigation yielded significant discoveries about Marcus's relationships with previous partners and colleagues that suggested a pattern of controlling behavior and systematic undermining of individuals who questioned his authority or threatened his professional image. The evidence I uncovered would eventually provide crucial context for understanding our situation within a broader pattern of predatory behavior, rather than as an isolated incident of marital conflict. The eighth area of my secret curriculum focused on understanding trauma responses and psychological recovery processes that would help me maintain emotional stability while conducting my investigation and preparing for legal proceedings. I studied resilience research and therapeutic techniques that could be applied independently to manage the stress of living with ongoing manipulation while building the case that would expose Marcus's deception. This psychological education proved essential for maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for strategic thinking and effective evidence gathering, while enduring continued exposure to Marcus's manipulation tactics. The coping strategies I developed enabled me to participate in family activities and social interactions without revealing my growing awareness of his campaign or my preparation for challenging his narrative. The ninth component involved mastering technology tools and digital security measures that would protect my evidence gathering from discovery while ensuring that the documentation I collected would be admissible in legal proceedings. I learned about cloud storage systems, encrypted communication methods, and digital forensics techniques that would preserve the integrity of recordings and documents while preventing Marcus from accessing or tampering with evidence that could expose his manipulation strategies. This technical education proved crucial for maintaining the secrecy necessary for effective investigation, while building a comprehensive database of evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny and demonstrate the systematic nature of Marcus's psychological abuse campaign. The 10th and most significant aspect of my hidden education involved developing a deeper understanding of my own strength, intelligence, and capacity for strategic thinking under extreme pressure. As I progressed through my investigation and evidence gathering, I discovered intellectual capabilities and emotional resilience that I had not previously recognized or fully developed. The woman who had entered our marriage assuming that Marcus's medical expertise and professional success qualified him to make important decisions about our family's welfare was being transformed into an individual capable of conducting sophisticated investigations, analyzing complex legal and financial situations, and developing strategic responses to psychological manipulation that rivaled the sophistication of the tactics being employed against her. This personal transformation was perhaps the most valuable outcome of my hidden education, as it provided me with the confidence and competence necessary for confronting Marcus's deception, while rebuilding my life and relationships in ways that honored both my own potential and the lessons learned through adversity. The comprehensive nature of this secret education prepared me not only for the specific challenges of exposing Marcus's manipulation, but also for the broader life changes that would result from reclaiming my autonomy and establishing my credibility as a competent individual whose perceptions and judgment could be trusted completely. By the time I was ready to present my evidence in court, I had transformed from a confused and isolated victim of systematic psychological abuse into a knowledgeable advocate, equipped with the documentation, legal understanding, and personal strength necessary for achieving justice, while protecting our daughters from continued exposure to their father's manipulative influence. The hidden education that Marcus's manipulation had inadvertently provided became the foundation for not only my personal vindication, but also my transformation into someone capable of helping other individuals recognize and respond to similar patterns of psychological abuse and coercive control. The moment that transformed me from a secret investigator gathering evidence into an active opponent preparing for decisive confrontation occurred on a humid Thursday evening in late September, when I accidentally discovered that Marcus was planning to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility within the following 2 weeks. This revelation shattered any remaining illusions I might have held about the temporary nature of his manipulation campaign, and forced me to confront the reality that his ultimate objective was not merely to control our family dynamics but to permanently remove me from any position where I could challenge his authority or expose his deception. The discovery occurred through circumstances that Marcus could never have anticipated. Our daughter Sophia had been experiencing recurring nightmares about losing her mother, dreams that had begun shortly after Marcus started having private conversations with both girls about my alleged psychological deterioration. During one of these episodes, Sophia came to our bedroom in the early hours of the morning, seeking comfort and reassurance about her fears that something terrible was going to happen to our family. Marcus was attending an emergency surgery at the hospital, leaving me alone to console our frightened daughter. As I held Sophia and tried to calm her fears, she began sharing details about conversations she had overheard between Marcus and his attorney, discussions that had apparently taken place in his study while the girls were supposed to be sleeping upstairs. The fragmented information Sophia provided painted a picture of legal preparations that extended far beyond the custody petition I had been anticipating. According to Sophia's recollections, Marcus and his attorney had discussed the timeline for psychiatric evaluation procedures that would support an involuntary commitment order. They had reviewed documentation requirements for establishing that I posed a danger to myself or others, despite the complete absence of any incidents that would support such claims. Most disturbingly, they had planned the timing of this commitment to occur immediately before the custody hearing, ensuring that I would be unable to present evidence or testimony that might challenge Marcus's narrative about my mental incompetence. The sophistication of this strategy was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Marcus had apparently concluded that simply winning custody of our daughters and control of our assets would not provide sufficient security for his long-term objectives. He needed to ensure that I would never be in a position to expose his manipulation tactics or challenge the narrative he had constructed about our marriage and my psychological condition. An involuntary psychiatric commitment would serve multiple purposes within his comprehensive strategy. It would provide medical documentation that could be used indefinitely to discredit any future claims I might make about his behavior. It would justify his complete control over our financial resources and family decisions. Most importantly, it would isolate me from any sources of support or advocacy that might enable me to rebuild my credibility or challenge his authority in the future. The realization that Marcus was prepared to have me imprisoned in a psychiatric facility based on fabricated evidence of mental illness represented a level of malicious intent that exceeded anything I had previously imagined possible, even after months of documenting his systematic manipulation. This was not merely emotional abuse or financial control, but a calculated attempt to destroy my freedom and autonomy permanently, while presenting himself as the tragic victim of circumstances created by my alleged psychological deterioration. Sophia's revelations also included details about Marcus's plans for managing our daughters, reactions to my sudden disappearance from their daily lives. He had apparently prepared explanations about the necessity of my hospitalization for intensive treatment that could not be provided in an outpatient setting. He had arranged for temporary childcare support that would enable him to maintain his surgical schedule while assuming full parental responsibilities. He had even consulted with child psychologists about strategies for helping Sophia and Isabella adjust to the trauma of having a mother who required long-term psychiatric care. The comprehensive nature of these preparations revealed that Marcus had been planning this escalation for months, while maintaining the pretense of working with mental health professionals to address my alleged symptoms through therapeutic interventions. The involuntary commitment was not an emergency response to a sudden crisis, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to achieve his ultimate objective of complete control over our family, while eliminating any possibility that I could challenge his narrative or expose his deception. This discovery created an immediate shift in both the urgency and the scope of my response strategy. The timeline for presenting my evidence had suddenly contracted from months to weeks, and the stakes had escalated from custody and financial disputes to the fundamental question of my freedom and the possibility of permanent separation from our daughters. The investigation I had been conducting with methodical patience now required acceleration and strategic focus that would maximize the impact of my revelations, while minimizing opportunities for Marcus to implement his commitment plan. The emotional impact of realizing that the person I had married and trusted with my life was prepared to have me institutionalized based on lies he had systematically constructed was devastating beyond anything I had previously experienced. The betrayal extended beyond our relationship to encompass his willingness to traumatize our children and destroy our family in service of his need for absolute control and his fear of exposure. However, this emotional devastation was accompanied by a crystalline clarity about the true nature of our situation and the necessity for decisive action. The woman who had spent months gathering evidence while hoping that Marcus might eventually recognize the damage his manipulation was causing to our family relationships was replaced by someone who understood that she was fighting for her fundamental freedom against an opponent who possessed no moral constraints regarding the methods he would employ to achieve his objectives. The strategic implications of Sophia's revelations required immediate reassessment of my evidence collection priorities and legal preparation timeline. I realized that simply documenting Marcus's manipulation tactics would no longer be sufficient for protecting myself and our daughters from his escalating campaign. I needed to expose not only the systematic nature of his psychological abuse but also the criminal intent behind his plans for involuntary commitment based on fabricated evidence of mental illness. This recognition led to an intensive period of focused investigation that would transform the scope and nature of the case I was preparing to present. The evidence I had already gathered about Marcus's manipulation techniques would now serve as the foundation for demonstrating a pattern of behavior that culminated in his planned use of the psychiatric system as a weapon for permanently silencing and controlling his victim. I began researching the legal requirements for involuntary psychiatric commitment and discovered that the process Marcus was planning to initiate would require documentation of specific incidents where I had demonstrated danger to myself or others. Since no such incidents had occurred, this documentation would necessarily be fabricated or deliberately mischaracterized to meet the legal criteria for involuntary treatment. This realization provided me with a framework for anticipating Marcus's next moves and developing strategies for exposing his plans before they could be implemented. I understood that he would need to create or manufacture incidents that could be presented as evidence of dangerous behavior, giving me opportunities to document his efforts at fabrication while building my case about the systematic nature of his deception campaign. The psychological impact of understanding that Marcus viewed me not merely as a spouse to be controlled but as an obstacle to be permanently eliminated required significant internal adjustment of my strategic thinking and emotional preparation. I could no longer approach our conflict as a marital dispute or custody disagreement, but needed to prepare for what amounted to a fight for my freedom against someone who possessed professional credentials and social authority that could be weaponized against me. The discovery also forced me to confront the reality that Marcus's manipulation of our daughters was far more extensive and damaging than I had previously understood. His private conversations with Sophia and Isabella were not merely attempts to influence their perceptions of my psychological condition, but components of a comprehensive strategy for ensuring their cooperation with his plans for my involuntary commitment and their acceptance of my permanent absence from their lives. This understanding intensified my motivation for exposing Marcus's campaign not only to protect myself, but also to prevent further psychological damage to our children, who were being manipulated into participating in their mother's destruction, while being told that their cooperation was necessary for the family's welfare and their own protection. The timeline acceleration required by Sophia's revelations also necessitated immediate decisions about when and how to reveal my knowledge of Marcus's plans, while maximizing the strategic advantage provided by his assumption that I remained unaware of his ultimate objectives. I realized that premature disclosure of my awareness could prompt him to accelerate his commitment timeline, or modify his approach in ways that would make my evidence gathering more difficult. However, continued silence carried the risk that Marcus might successfully implement his involuntary commitment plan before I could present my evidence or alert legal authorities to the systematic nature of his deception campaign. The balance between strategic patience and necessary urgency required careful calculation of timing that would maximize the effectiveness of my revelations while ensuring my continued freedom to present evidence and testimony. The catalyst moment provided by Sophia's revelations had transformed my understanding of both the scope of Marcus's manipulation and the urgency required for my response strategy. The woman who had been secretly gathering evidence of psychological abuse was now preparing to expose a comprehensive criminal enterprise that involved fraud, conspiracy, and planned false imprisonment implemented through abuse of professional relationships and institutional authority. The evidence I had been collecting through careful observation and documentation would now serve as the foundation for a much larger case that would demonstrate not only Marcus's systematic manipulation of our family dynamics, but also his willingness to abuse the psychiatric system and legal processes to achieve permanent control over his victims while eliminating any possibility of accountability for his actions. The transformation from victim to advocate that had been developing gradually through months of investigation and analysis was now complete. The catalyst moment had provided the final piece of understanding necessary for recognizing the true nature of what I was confronting, and the comprehensive response strategy that would be required for protecting not only myself, but also our daughters, from continued exposure to Marcus's escalating manipulation and abuse. The battle ahead would test everything I had learned about documentation, legal strategy, and psychological resilience, but the clarity provided by understanding Marcus's ultimate objectives had equipped me with the motivation and strategic focus necessary for exposing his deception campaign, while protecting our family from the devastating consequences of his success. The morning after discovering Marcus's plan for my involuntary commitment, I faced my first direct challenge to his manipulation campaign when Dr. Patricia Whitman, the psychiatrist he had selected for my ongoing treatment, called to schedule what she described as an urgent evaluation session to assess my current psychological state and determine appropriate intervention strategies. The timing of this call occurring less than 24 hours after Sophia's revelations about the commitment timeline confirmed that Marcus was accelerating his implementation schedule and that my window for strategic response was contracting more rapidly than I had anticipated. Dr. Whitman's voice carried an undertone of professional concern that immediately alerted me to the serious nature of this appointment. She explained that Marcus had contacted her the previous evening to report significant changes in my behavior patterns that suggested possible escalation of my psychological symptoms requiring immediate clinical assessment. According to her summary of Marcus's report, I had been exhibiting increased paranoid thinking, emotional volatility, and concerning statements about feeling persecuted by family members and medical professionals who were trying to help me. The sophistication of Marcus's fabrication was immediately apparent. He had apparently provided Dr. Whitman with specific examples of recent incidents where my behavior had allegedly demonstrated dangerous instability, including episodes of angry outbursts directed toward our daughters, irrational accusations about his professional colleagues conspiring against our family, and expressions of self-harm ideation during periods of emotional distress. Every detail Marcus had reported to Dr. Whitman was either completely fabricated or represented a deliberate distortion of normal interactions and conversations that had occurred within our household. The angry outbursts he described were actually moments when I had expressed frustration about household management issues or concerns about our daughter's academic performance. The accusations about conspiracy involved questions I had raised about the coordination between various medical professionals, treating me without my full understanding of their communication protocols. The self-harm ideation was apparently based on casual comments I had made about feeling exhausted or overwhelmed by the demands of managing our family responsibilities. However, when filtered through Marcus's medical expertise and presented within the framework of his established narrative about my psychological deterioration, these normal expressions of stress and concern had been transformed into clinical symptoms that supported his claims about my dangerous mental instability and the urgent need for intensive psychiatric intervention. The realization that Marcus was prepared to fabricate specific incidents of dangerous behavior represented a fundamental escalation in the sophistication and malicious intent of his manipulation campaign. He was no longer simply characterizing my normal emotional responses as symptoms of psychological problems, but was actively creating false documentation that could be used to justify involuntary commitment proceedings. This recognition required immediate strategic adjustment of my response approach. I could no longer afford to continue my passive evidence gathering, while hoping to expose Marcus's deception through gradual accumulation of documentation. The appointment with Dr. Whitman represented a critical juncture where Marcus's fabricated narrative would either be challenged through my presentation of contradictory evidence or reinforced through my acquiescence to his characterizations of my mental state. The decision to directly confront Whitman with evidence of Marcus's systematic manipulation required careful consideration of both the potential benefits and risks involved in revealing my awareness of his deception campaign. Successful confrontation could disrupt his timeline for involuntary commitment, while beginning the process of establishing my credibility as a reliable narrator, whose perceptions and documentation could be trusted by medical and legal professionals. However, premature revelation of my evidence could also prompt Marcus to accelerate his implementation timeline or modify his approach in ways that would make my subsequent legal challenge more difficult. Additionally, if Dr. Whitman remained committed to Marcus's narrative despite contradictory evidence, my direct challenge could be characterized as additional confirmation of the paranoid thinking patterns and resistance to treatment that he had described in his reports about my psychological condition. After careful analysis of the strategic implications, I concluded that the appointment with Dr. Whitman represented both my best opportunity for disrupting Marcus's commitment timeline and my most significant risk for premature exposure of my investigation and evidence-gathering activities. The decision to proceed with direct confrontation was based on my assessment that the risks of continued passive response exceeded the dangers associated with revealing my awareness of Marcus's systematic manipulation. The preparation for this confrontation required intensive organization of the evidence I had gathered during months of secret investigation, with particular focus on documentation that would demonstrate the fabricated nature of Marcus's recent reports to Dr. Whitman about dangerous behavioral incidents. The audio recordings I had collected included conversations where Marcus explicitly acknowledged his manipulation strategies and discussed his plans for using psychiatric evaluation as a weapon against me. The financial documentation I had compiled revealed the systematic asset transfers and decision-making exclusions that supported my claims about Marcus's broader campaign for control over our family resources. The research I had conducted into his professional relationships with medical colleagues treating me provided evidence of conflicts of interest that compromised the independence and objectivity of their clinical assessments. Most importantly, The timeline documentation I had maintained showed that Marcus's reports about recent escalation in my psychological symptoms corresponded precisely with periods when I had been gathering evidence about his manipulation tactics, suggesting that his claims about dangerous behavior were actually responses to his growing concern about potential exposure of his deception campaign. The appointment with Dr. Whitman took place in her office at the Riverside Psychiatric Associates building, a modern medical facility that projected professional competence and clinical authority. The environment was designed to reinforce the power dynamic between medical professional and patient, with Dr. Whitman positioned behind an imposing desk while I was directed to a lower chair that required me to look upward when making eye contact during our conversation. Dr. Whitman began the session by expressing her concern about the reports she had received from Marcus regarding recent changes in my behavior and emotional stability. Her tone was carefully modulated to convey both professional authority and personal compassion, creating an atmosphere where resistance to her guidance could be interpreted as additional evidence of the psychological problems that had necessitated this urgent evaluation. However, rather than responding to her questions about my recent emotional state and behavioral patterns, I immediately presented her with a comprehensive folder containing the evidence I had gathered about Marcus's systematic manipulation campaign. The documentation included audio recordings of conversations where Marcus acknowledged his deception strategies, financial records showing unauthorized asset transfers, and research demonstrating conflicts of interest in my previous psychiatric evaluations. The impact on Dr. Whitman was immediate and profound. As she reviewed the audio recordings and supporting documentation, her expression shifted from professional concern to recognition that she had been manipulated into participating in a sophisticated campaign of psychological abuse. The evidence clearly demonstrated that Marcus's reports about my behavioral problems were fabricated, and that his medical expertise had been weaponized to create false clinical impressions that supported his broader strategy for gaining control over our family. Dr. Whitman's initial response was one of professional embarrassment, combined with genuine concern about the ethical implications of her unwitting participation in Marcus's manipulation campaign. She acknowledged that the evidence I had presented fundamentally contradicted everything Marcus had reported about my psychological condition, and raised serious questions about the validity of all previous assessments that had been based on his observations and recommendations. However, Dr. Whitman also expressed concern about the legal and professional ramifications of acknowledging that she had been deceived by a colleague whose medical reputation and expertise had provided credibility for his false reports about my mental state. The admission that her clinical judgment had been compromised by Marcus's manipulation could potentially affect her professional standing and raise questions about her competence to evaluate other patients whose treatment had been influenced by similar professional relationships. The complexity of Dr. Whitman's position required careful management of the conversation to ensure that her legitimate concerns about professional consequences did not prevent her from acknowledging the evidence and providing support for my efforts to expose Marcus's deception campaign. I emphasized that her willingness to recognize the manipulation and adjust her clinical assessment based on new evidence demonstrated professional integrity rather than clinical incompetence. More importantly, I explained that her documentation of Marcus's deception tactics and fabricated reports would provide crucial professional testimony that could protect other potential victims from similar manipulation, while establishing clear evidence of criminal intent behind his systematic abuse campaign. Dr. Whitman's agreement to revise her clinical assessment and provide documentation supporting my claims about Marcus's manipulation represented the first significant victory in my direct challenge to his narrative about my psychological instability. Her professional testimony would carry substantial weight in legal proceedings and could potentially disrupt his timeline for involuntary commitment while providing credible support for my allegations about systematic psychological abuse. However, this victory also created immediate risks for my safety and the security of the evidence I had gathered. Marcus would likely discover Dr. Whitman's change in clinical assessment within days, alerting him to my awareness of his manipulation campaign and potentially prompting him to accelerate his commitment timeline or implement alternative strategies for silencing my challenges to his authority. The successful confrontation with Dr. Whitman demonstrated that my evidence was sufficiently comprehensive and compelling to convince medical professionals who had previously accepted Marcus's narrative about my psychological condition. This validation provided crucial confidence for the broader legal challenge I was preparing, while establishing precedent for how other professionals might respond when presented with documentation of Marcus's systematic deception. The transformation of Dr. Whitman from unwitting participant in Marcus's manipulation campaign to ally in exposing his deception represented a fundamental shift in the dynamics of our conflict. For the first time since recognizing the systematic nature of his psychological abuse, I had succeeded in converting someone from his network of professional supporters into a witness who could provide credible testimony about his tactics and their impact on both me and the medical professionals he had manipulated into participating in his campaign. The strategic implications of this first victory extended beyond the immediate disruption of Marcus's commitment timeline to include broader possibilities for exposing the extent of his manipulation network and building credible support for legal proceedings that would hold him accountable for his systematic abuse, while protecting our daughters from continued exposure to his deceptive influence. The challenge I had faced with Dr. Whitman had tested both my evidence-gathering capabilities and my strategic thinking under pressure, while providing crucial validation of my transformation from passive victim to active advocate, capable of confronting professional authority with documented evidence of systematic deception. The successful outcome of this first direct challenge provided both practical advancement of my legal strategy and psychological confirmation that the investigation and preparation I had conducted during months of secret research had equipped me with the knowledge and documentation necessary for exposing Marcus's manipulation campaign, while building credible support for my efforts to protect our family from his continued abuse. The 48 hours following my confrontation with Dr. Whitman unleashed a systematic escalation of Marcus's manipulation campaign that revealed the true extent of his network and the sophisticated nature of his contingency planning. His discovery that I had successfully challenged his narrative with credible evidence prompted a calculated response that demonstrated both his desperation to maintain control and his willingness to employ increasingly dangerous tactics to silence my resistance to his authority. The first indication that Marcus had learned about my successful intervention came through a phone call from our family attorney, Jonathan Breslin, who requested an urgent meeting to discuss what he described as serious concerns about my psychological stability and its potential impact on the custody proceedings. The timing and tone of this call made clear that Marcus had immediately activated his professional network to contain the damage from Dr. Whitman's revised assessment, while implementing backup strategies designed to discredit my evidence and reinforce his narrative about my mental incompetence. Breslin's office occupied the top floor of the prestigious Hamilton Tower, a setting designed to project legal authority and professional competence that would intimidate clients while reinforcing the expertise of the attorneys who practiced within its marble-appointed corridors. The environment served Marcus's strategic purposes by creating a power dynamic that positioned me as a potentially unstable individual, whose claims required careful evaluation by legal professionals whose judgment could be trusted implicitly. However, my months of preparation had equipped me with both the documentation and psychological readiness necessary for confronting legal authority with evidence that contradicted their predetermined assumptions about my credibility and mental state. The briefcase I carried into Breslin's office contained comprehensive files that would demonstrate not only the fabricated nature of Marcus's allegations, but also the systematic manipulation of professional relationships that had enabled his deception campaign. Breslin began our meeting by expressing his concern about reports he had received regarding my recent behavior and the potential impact of my psychological condition on my ability to participate effectively in custody proceedings. His presentation of these concerns was delivered with the careful professionalism that attorneys employ when dealing with clients whose mental stability may affect their legal strategy and courtroom credibility. The reports Breslin referenced had apparently been provided by Marcus, and included detailed descriptions of incidents where I had allegedly demonstrated paranoid thinking, emotional instability, and resistance to therapeutic intervention that suggested possible deterioration in my psychological condition. According to Breslin's summary, these reports indicated that my claims about Marcus's manipulation were manifestations of delusional thinking patterns that had developed as my mental health declined. The sophistication of this coordinated response demonstrated that Marcus had anticipated the possibility that his manipulation campaign might face professional challenges, and had prepared comprehensive strategies for discrediting any evidence that contradicted his narrative. The involvement of our family attorney in reinforcing his psychological assessment revealed the extent to which he had cultivated professional relationships that could be activated to support his deception when direct challenges emerged. Rather than responding defensively to Breslin's presentation of Marcus's allegations, I immediately presented him with the comprehensive documentation I had assembled during months of investigation. The evidence included audio recordings where Marcus explicitly acknowledged his manipulation strategies, financial records demonstrating unauthorized asset transfers, correspondence revealing conflicts of interest in my psychiatric evaluations, and Dr. Whitman's revised clinical assessment that contradicted all previous reports about my psychological condition. The impact of this evidence on Breslin was profound and immediate. As he reviewed the audio recordings and supporting documentation, his expression shifted from professional concern to recognition that he had been provided with false information about my mental state, and that his client had engaged in systematic deception that potentially violated both ethical and legal standards. The recordings were particularly compelling because they captured Marcus discussing his manipulation tactics in clinical terms that demonstrated both his understanding of psychological abuse techniques and his deliberate implementation of strategies designed to undermine my credibility while positioning himself as a concerned spouse managing his wife's mental health crisis. Breslin's initial response reflected the professional dilemma faced by attorneys who discover that their clients have provided false information that compromises the integrity of legal proceedings. His acknowledgement that the evidence fundamentally contradicted Marcus's reports about my psychological condition created immediate concerns about his continued representation of Marcus while raising questions about his ethical obligations regarding the false information he had been provided. However, Breslin also expressed concern about the implications of Marcus's deception for the custody proceedings and the broader legal ramifications of systematic manipulation that involved fabricated medical reports and fraudulent claims about mental incompetence. The evidence suggested that Marcus had engaged in criminal behavior that extended beyond family law violations to include fraud, conspiracy, and potentially charges related to planned false imprisonment through involuntary psychiatric commitment. The complexity of the legal situation required immediate consultation with additional attorneys who specialized in criminal law and civil rights violations, as the scope of Marcus's manipulation campaign exceeded the expertise typically required for family law proceedings. Breslin recommended that I engage independent legal representation that could address both the custody issues and the broader criminal implications of Marcus's systematic abuse while ensuring that my evidence was properly presented to appropriate law enforcement authorities. This recommendation represented a significant victory in my challenge to Marcus's manipulation campaign, as it provided professional validation of my evidence from a legal authority who had initially accepted Marcus's narrative about my psychological instability. Breslin's acknowledgement that the evidence demonstrated systematic deception rather than paranoid delusions created precedent for how other professional authorities might respond when presented with comprehensive documentation of Marcus's tactics. However, this legal victory also intensified the immediate risks I faced, as Marcus became aware that his network of professional supporters was being compromised by evidence that exposed his deception campaign. The systematic nature of his manipulation suggested that he possessed additional contingency strategies for dealing with challenges to his authority, including tactics that might threaten my physical safety or the security of the evidence I had gathered. The second phase of Marcus's escalated response emerged through direct confrontation within our household, when he discovered that I had been recording conversations and gathering evidence of his manipulation tactics. His initial reaction combined professional calculation with personal rage, as he realized that his systematic campaign had been documented comprehensively enough to support criminal charges while destroying his professional reputation and medical career. The confrontation occurred in his study, surrounded by the medical degrees and professional awards that had provided credibility for his manipulation campaign while serving as symbols of the authority he had weaponized against me. The irony of this setting was profound, as the achievements that had enabled his systematic abuse were now threatened by evidence that exposed how he had perverted his professional expertise for criminal purposes. Marcus's approach to this confrontation demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that had characterized his entire campaign against my sanity and autonomy. Rather than expressing anger or making direct threats, he attempted to regain control through renewed implementation of gaslighting tactics that had previously proven effective in undermining my confidence and credibility. He began by expressing disappointed concern about my apparent deterioration into paranoid thinking patterns that had led me to misinterpret his loving care as somehow threatening or manipulative. According to his characterization, my evidence-gathering activities represented symptoms of psychological problems that had progressed beyond what could be managed through outpatient treatment and now required intensive psychiatric intervention. This attempted manipulation was particularly insidious because it followed the same patterns that had previously succeeded in convincing me to question my own perceptions while accepting his medical expertise as the reliable guide to understanding my psychological condition. However, months of education and investigation had equipped me with both intellectual understanding of these tactics and emotional resilience that prevented his manipulation from achieving its intended psychological impact. My response to Marcus's attempted gaslighting involved calm presentation of specific evidence that contradicted his characterizations while demonstrating my complete awareness of his manipulation techniques and their systematic implementation throughout our marriage. The audio recordings I had gathered included conversations where he had explicitly acknowledged his deception strategies, making his current attempts to gaslight me appear desperate and ineffective rather than professionally authoritative. The failure of his gaslighting tactics to restore psychological control prompted Marcus to escalate his approach through direct threats about the consequences I would face for challenging his authority and interfering with his professional relationships. These threats included warnings about the impact my actions would have on our daughters, who would suffer from the publicity and social consequences of my allegations against their father. However, these threats also provided additional evidence of Marcus's calculated approach to psychological manipulation, as I was able to record his explicit acknowledgement of his willingness to harm our children's welfare, to maintain his control over our family dynamics. This documentation would prove crucial for custody proceedings and criminal investigations that would evaluate his fitness as a parent and his willingness to prioritize his own interests over our daughters' emotional security. The third component of Marcus's escalated response involved activation of his broader professional network to implement coordinated challenges to my credibility that extended beyond the medical and legal professionals he had previously influenced. This network included colleagues at the hospital where he practiced, members of professional medical associations, and community leaders who had accepted his narrative about being a dedicated surgeon whose wife's mental illness created personal challenges that he managed with exceptional patience and professional expertise. The systematic activation of this network created immediate challenges for my social relationships and community standing, while generating coordinated pressure designed to isolate me from potential sources of support and advocacy. The sophistication of this response demonstrated that Marcus had prepared comprehensive contingency strategies for managing threats to his manipulation campaign while maintaining his professional reputation and community standing. However, the coordinated nature of these attacks also provided evidence of conspiracy and systematic deception that would support both criminal charges and civil litigation against Marcus and his enablers. The documentation I had gathered during months of investigation had prepared me to recognize these tactics as further confirmation of his calculated approach to psychological abuse, rather than legitimate concerns about my mental stability. The gathering storm represented by Marcus's escalated response created both immediate dangers and strategic opportunities for advancing my legal challenge, while protecting our daughters from continued exposure to his manipulative influence. The intensity of his reaction confirmed that my evidence posed genuine threats to his authority and professional standing, while demonstrating his willingness to employ increasingly desperate tactics to maintain control. The comprehensive nature of his response also revealed the full extent of his manipulation network and provided opportunities for gathering additional evidence about the systematic nature of his deception campaign. Each professional relationship he activated in his defense created potential witnesses and documentation that could support broader legal proceedings while demonstrating the scope of his criminal enterprise. The storm that Marcus had unleashed would ultimately provide the final evidence necessary for completely exposing his manipulation campaign, while establishing the foundation for legal proceedings that would hold him accountable for his systematic abuse and protect our family from his continued influence. The moment when my accumulated evidence reached the critical threshold necessary for complete exposure of Marcus's manipulation campaign arrived through an unexpected source that would transform the dynamics of our legal confrontation while providing irrefutable documentation of his systematic deception. Dr. Samuel Chen, the chief psychiatrist at Metropolitan Medical Center and Marcus's former colleague from residency training, contacted me directly after reviewing the clinical files and professional correspondence that had been shared within their psychiatric consultation network regarding my case. Dr. Chen's call represented a breakthrough that exceeded anything I had anticipated during months of careful evidence gathering and strategic planning. His position as department chief provided him with access to comprehensive documentation of Marcus's manipulation of professional relationships, while his medical expertise enabled him to recognize the systematic nature of the psychological abuse campaign that had been disguised as legitimate clinical concern for a colleague's spouse experiencing mental health challenges. The conversation with Dr. Chen took place in his office at Metropolitan Medical Center, a clinical environment that reinforced the gravity of the revelations he was prepared to share, while providing professional legitimacy for the evidence that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of legal proceedings against Marcus. The setting represented the institutional authority of medical practice being aligned against Marcus, rather than supporting his narrative about my psychological instability. Dr. Chen began our meeting by acknowledging the professional ethical concerns that had motivated his decision to contact me directly rather than continuing to observe Marcus's manipulation campaign through traditional colleague consultation processes. His review of the clinical documentation and professional correspondence had revealed patterns of behavior that violated fundamental medical ethics while demonstrating systematic abuse of professional relationships and institutional authority. The evidence Dr. Chen presented included detailed documentation of Marcus's deliberate misrepresentation of clinical information when consulting with other medical professionals about my psychological condition. The correspondence revealed that Marcus had provided selective and distorted information to psychiatrists and therapists treating me, ensuring that their clinical assessments would support his predetermined narrative about my mental instability, rather than reflecting objective evaluation of my actual psychological state. More significantly, Dr. Chen had discovered that Marcus had engaged in systematic manipulation of professional relationships by leveraging his surgical reputation and institutional standing to influence colleagues who lacked sufficient information to recognize the fabricated nature of his clinical reports. The psychiatric consultation network that should have provided independent professional oversight had been compromised by Marcus's strategic cultivation of relationships that prioritized colleague loyalty over patient protection and clinical objectivity. The documentation Dr. Chen provided included email correspondence, where Marcus had explicitly discussed strategies for managing professional colleagues who might question his assessment of my psychological condition. These communications revealed his understanding that successful manipulation of the medical establishment required careful management of information flow and strategic influence over key decision-makers who could affect clinical recommendations and treatment approaches. The evidence also demonstrated that Marcus had violated fundamental principles of medical ethics by practicing medicine on his own spouse through proxy relationships with other healthcare providers, while maintaining the pretense that he was simply a concerned husband seeking professional guidance about his wife's mental health challenges. This ethical violation created legal exposure that extended beyond family law disputes to include professional misconduct charges that could result in loss of medical licensure and criminal liability. Dr. Chen's willingness to provide professional testimony about Marcus's ethical violations represented a transformative development in my legal strategy that would establish credible medical authority supporting my allegations while demonstrating the systematic nature of his deception campaign. The institutional credibility represented by Dr. Chen's position and expertise provided validation that could overcome the professional relationships Marcus had cultivated to support his narrative about my psychological instability. However, Dr. Chen also revealed that Marcus's manipulation network extended beyond individual professional relationships to include systematic abuse of institutional processes and administrative systems within the medical establishment. His investigation had discovered that Marcus had influenced hospital administration and professional oversight bodies to accept his characterizations of ethical concerns raised by colleagues who had questioned his treatment of our family situation. This institutional manipulation had enabled Marcus to preemptively discredit potential challenges to his authority, while positioning himself as a dedicated professional whose personal challenges with his wife's mental illness required understanding and support from the medical community rather than scrutiny and investigation. The sophistication of this institutional strategy demonstrated the comprehensive nature of his deception campaign, while revealing additional criminal exposure related to fraud and conspiracy charges. The revelation of Marcus's institutional manipulation also provided insight into the broader scope of his professional misconduct and its potential impact on other patients and families who might have been affected by his willingness to abuse medical authority for personal objectives. Dr. Chen's investigation suggested that systematic ethical violations of this nature rarely remain isolated to single cases, but typically represent patterns of behavior that affect multiple victims over extended periods. The strategic implications of Dr. Chen's evidence required immediate reassessment of my legal approach and timeline for presenting comprehensive challenges to Marcus's manipulation campaign. The professional credibility and institutional authority represented by Dr. Chen's testimony provided opportunities for coordinated legal and regulatory action that could address both the immediate threats to my family and the broader pattern of professional misconduct that endangered other potential victims. Dr. Chen's collaboration also provided access to additional professional networks and investigative resources that could accelerate the evidence-gathering process, while ensuring that all aspects of Marcus's deception campaign were documented comprehensively enough to support successful legal proceedings. The institutional credibility he represented could facilitate cooperation from other medical professionals who might have observed concerning behavior but lacked sufficient context to recognize its systematic nature. The psychological impact of gaining Dr. Chen's support represented validation of my investigation and evidence gathering that exceeded anything I had experienced during previous challenges to Marcus's authority. The recognition from a respected medical professional that my perceptions and documentation were not only accurate but also represented systematic criminal behavior provided confidence that reinforced my commitment to complete exposure of his manipulation campaign. However, Dr. Chen also warned that Marcus's discovery of our collaboration would likely prompt escalated response tactics that could include direct threats to my physical safety or attempts to discredit my evidence through coordinated attacks on my credibility that leveraged his remaining professional relationships. The comprehensive nature of his deception suggested that he possessed contingency strategies for managing existential threats to his authority and professional standing. This warning required immediate implementation of security measures and strategic planning that would protect both the evidence I had gathered and my ability to present testimony in legal proceedings, while ensuring the safety of our daughters who remained vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation and potential retaliation efforts. The escalation of stakes from family law disputes to criminal charges and professional misconduct proceedings created risks that extended beyond traditional custody and financial conflicts. The third phase of revelations provided by Dr. Chen involved documentation of Marcus's systematic research into involuntary commitment procedures and his cultivation of relationships with psychiatric facilities that could be influenced to accept patients based on fabricated clinical assessments rather than independent evaluation of mental health status. This evidence confirmed the most disturbing aspects of Sophia's revelations, while providing professional documentation of criminal intent behind Marcus's planned institutionalization strategy. The facility relationships Marcus had developed included arrangements with administrative personnel who could expedite commitment proceedings, while minimizing opportunities for independent medical evaluation that might challenge the clinical assessments he had fabricated to support involuntary treatment orders. These arrangements represented systematic corruption of psychiatric care systems that should have provided protection for vulnerable individuals, rather than enabling their abuse by manipulative family members. Dr. Chen's investigation had also revealed that Marcus had researched legal precedents and procedural requirements for involuntary commitment with the same methodical approach he applied to complex surgical procedures, ensuring that his fabricated evidence would meet technical criteria while avoiding scrutiny that might expose the fraudulent nature of his clinical claims. This professional-level preparation for criminal activity demonstrated both the calculated nature of his intentions and the sophisticated understanding of institutional systems that enabled his manipulation campaign. The evidence of systematic preparation for false imprisonment provided the strongest possible documentation of criminal intent, while establishing clear grounds for emergency legal intervention that could prevent implementation of Marcus's commitment strategy. The professional credibility of Dr. Chen's testimony about these arrangements would carry substantial weight with law enforcement authorities and judicial officials who might otherwise be reluctant to challenge medical assessments provided by credentialed professionals. The comprehensive nature of Dr. Chen's evidence also provided opportunities for broader institutional reform that could prevent similar abuse of medical authority and psychiatric care systems by other manipulative individuals who might attempt to weaponize professional relationships for personal objectives. The systematic documentation of Marcus's techniques and strategies could serve as educational material for training programs designed to help medical professionals recognize and respond to colleague misconduct. The revelation phase represented by Dr. Chen's collaboration marked the transition from individual evidence gathering to institutional validation and support that would enable comprehensive legal action against Marcus while protecting other potential victims from similar manipulation campaigns. The professional credibility and investigative resources he provided transformed my position from isolated challenger to supported advocate, with institutional backing for exposing systematic professional misconduct. The strategic advantage provided by Dr. Chen's evidence and testimony created opportunities for coordinated legal action that could address all aspects of Marcus's manipulation campaign, while ensuring that appropriate regulatory and law enforcement authorities were engaged to prevent future misconduct and protect other vulnerable individuals from similar abuse of medical authority and institutional systems. The revelation of the full scope of Marcus's deception campaign through Dr. Chen's professional investigation provided both the evidence necessary for achieving justice and the institutional support required for ensuring that his systematic abuse of professional relationships and medical authority would result in appropriate accountability and systemic reforms that could prevent similar crimes from affecting other families and individuals. The transformation of my position from isolated victim to supported advocate with professional institutional backing represented the culmination of months of patient evidence gathering, while establishing the foundation for comprehensive legal proceedings that would expose the full extent of Marcus's manipulation campaign and ensure appropriate consequences for his systematic abuse of medical authority and family relationships. The systematic counterattack that Marcus launched following his discovery of Dr. Chen's collaboration represented the most sophisticated and dangerous phase of his manipulation campaign, revealing both the extensive network of professional relationships he had cultivated over his medical career and his willingness to employ increasingly desperate tactics to preserve his authority and prevent accountability for his systematic deception. The coordinated nature of this resistance demonstrated that Marcus possessed contingency strategies for managing existential threats to his professional standing, while attempting to discredit evidence that could result in criminal charges and permanent destruction of his medical career. The initial component of Marcus's counterattack involved direct challenges to Dr. Chen's professional credibility through formal complaints filed with the medical board and hospital administration, alleging ethical violations related to his unauthorized review of confidential patient records and breach of colleague consultation protocols. These complaints were strategically crafted to exploit legitimate concerns about patient privacy and professional boundaries, while creating institutional pressure that could force Dr. Chen to withdraw his support for my legal challenge, or compromise his willingness to provide testimony about Marcus's manipulation campaign. The sophistication of these complaints reflected Marcus's comprehensive understanding of medical ethics and institutional governance systems that could be weaponized to silence potential witnesses, while creating plausible justification for challenging their credibility and professional standing. The formal nature of these complaints created immediate procedural obligations for institutional review that could delay or complicate Dr. Chen's availability for legal proceedings, while generating documentation that Marcus could use to question his reliability as a witness. However, Marcus's assault on Dr. Chen's professional standing also provided additional evidence of his systematic approach to silencing opposition, while demonstrating his willingness to abuse institutional processes for personal protection. The timing and content of these complaints clearly indicated retaliatory intent rather than legitimate ethical concerns, creating exposure for additional charges related to witness intimidation and obstruction of justice that would strengthen the criminal case against his manipulation campaign. Dr. Chen's response to these professional challenges demonstrated both his commitment to exposing Marcus's misconduct and his understanding of the institutional dynamics that enabled systematic abuse of medical authority. Rather than retreating from his support for my legal challenge, Dr. Chen chose to document Marcus's retaliatory tactics as additional evidence of his willingness to abuse professional relationships and institutional systems to maintain control over potentially damaging situations. The institutional review processes triggered by Marcus's complaints also created opportunities for broader investigation of his professional conduct and examination of other cases where his behavior might have violated ethical standards or compromised patient care. The administrative scrutiny generated by his attempts to discredit Dr. Chen ultimately provided investigators with access to comprehensive records that revealed patterns of professional misconduct extending beyond our family situation. The second phase of Marcus's resistance involved activation of his broader professional network to generate coordinated challenges to my credibility that leveraged the social authority and institutional standing of his medical colleagues. This campaign included strategic communication to community leaders, medical professionals, and social contacts, who had previously accepted his narrative about being a dedicated surgeon managing his wife's mental health challenges with exceptional patience and professional expertise. The coordinated nature of these attacks required sophisticated management of information flow and strategic influence over key opinion leaders who possess sufficient social authority to affect community perceptions of our family conflict while generating pressure that could compromise my legal strategy. Marcus had apparently prepared detailed briefings about my alleged psychological problems that could be shared with influential community members who lacked the context necessary for recognizing the fabricated nature of his clinical claims. These community influence operations were particularly insidious because they involved individuals who genuinely believed they were supporting a respected medical colleague facing personal challenges, rather than participating in a coordinated campaign to discredit evidence of systematic psychological abuse. The manipulation of well-intentioned community members provided Marcus with credible advocates who could reinforce his narrative while shielding him from accusations of orchestrating deliberate attacks on my reputation and credibility. However, the systematic nature of these influence operations also created evidence of conspiracy and coordinated deception that could support broader legal charges while demonstrating the comprehensive scope of Marcus's manipulation campaign. The documentation I had gathered during months of investigation included recordings and correspondence that revealed his strategic planning for managing community perceptions and his explicit acknowledgement of the fabricated nature of claims he was asking others to support. The third component of Marcus's resistance strategy involved direct legal challenges to the admissibility and credibility of evidence I had gathered during my investigation of his manipulation tactics. His new legal representation, which included attorneys specializing in criminal defense and professional liability, immediately filed motions challenging the legality of audio recordings and questioning the chain of custody for financial documents that demonstrated his unauthorized asset transfers and systematic exclusion of me from important family decisions. These legal challenges were designed to exclude the most damaging evidence from court proceedings, while creating procedural complications that could delay legal resolution and provide additional time for implementing alternative strategies to discredit my allegations. The technical nature of these evidentiary challenges required sophisticated legal response that could demonstrate both the proper collection methods used for gathering evidence and the compelling nature of the systematic patterns revealed through comprehensive documentation. The criminal defense attorneys Marcus had retained possessed extensive experience in challenging evidence related to domestic violence and psychological abuse cases, enabling them to employ established legal strategies for discrediting victim testimony while exploiting institutional biases that often favor professional defendants whose social standing and credibility exceed that of their accusers. Their involvement indicated that Marcus recognized the criminal exposure created by his manipulation campaign and was prepared to invest substantial resources in avoiding accountability for his systematic abuse. However, the legal challenges to my evidence also created opportunities for comprehensive judicial review of the documentation I had assembled, while establishing clear precedent for the admissibility of recorded conversations and financial records that demonstrated systematic manipulation and abuse. The involvement of experienced criminal defense attorneys validated the serious nature of potential charges while providing additional credibility for allegations that might otherwise be dismissed as marital conflict rather than criminal behavior. The fourth phase of Marcus's resistance involved direct intimidation tactics designed to discourage my continued pursuit of legal challenges, while creating psychological pressure that could force me to withdraw allegations or accept settlement agreements that would prevent public exposure of his manipulation campaign. These intimidation efforts included surveillance of my daily activities, strategic encounters in public settings designed to create anxiety and uncertainty, and implicit threats communicated through intermediaries who maintained plausible deniability about their connection to coordinated harassment. The surveillance activities were particularly sophisticated and included monitoring of my communications, tracking of my location and movement patterns, and observation of my interactions with legal representatives and potential witnesses. The systematic nature of this surveillance suggested professional implementation that exceeded the resources typically available to individual defendants, while indicating Marcus's willingness to employ criminal tactics to protect himself from accountability for previous criminal behavior. The psychological impact of recognizing that I was under systematic surveillance created additional stress and anxiety that Marcus apparently hoped would compromise my ability to participate effectively in legal proceedings, while providing evidence that could be used to support renewed claims about my psychological instability and paranoid thinking patterns. The sophistication of these intimidation tactics demonstrated his understanding of psychological manipulation techniques that could be employed outside therapeutic or family settings to achieve strategic objectives. However, the intimidation campaign also provided additional evidence of Marcus's systematic approach to silencing opposition, while demonstrating his willingness to engage in criminal behavior to avoid accountability for previous misconduct. The documentation of surveillance activities and intimidation tactics strengthened the criminal case against his manipulation campaign, while providing grounds for emergency protective orders that could limit his access to our family and restrict his ability to continue harassment activities. The fifth component of Marcus's resistance strategy involved systematic attempts to undermine my relationship with our daughters through intensified manipulation of their perceptions about our family conflict and their mother's psychological condition. This campaign included private conversations where Marcus characterized my legal challenge as evidence of deteriorating mental health, while positioning himself as the stable parent who could protect them from the trauma and embarrassment created by my allegations against him. The manipulation of Sophia and Isabella represented perhaps the most morally reprehensible aspect of Marcus's resistance campaign, as it involved using our children's natural concerns about family stability to generate support for his efforts to avoid accountability, while potentially damaging their psychological development through systematic exposure to deception and manipulation techniques. The intensity of these manipulation efforts suggested Marcus's recognition that maintaining our daughters' support was crucial for his broader strategy of discrediting my allegations. The systematic nature of Marcus's manipulation of our children also created opportunities for professional evaluation and intervention that could protect Sophia and Isabella from continued psychological abuse, while providing expert testimony about the impact of manipulation campaigns on child development and family relationships. The involvement of child psychology specialists in evaluating our family dynamics would ultimately provide additional professional support for legal proceedings, while ensuring appropriate protection for our daughters regardless of the outcome of criminal charges against Marcus. The comprehensive scope of Marcus's resistance campaign demonstrated both his desperation to avoid accountability and his sophisticated understanding of institutional systems that could be exploited to discredit evidence and intimidate opposition. However, the systematic nature of his resistance also provided extensive documentation of his willingness to engage in criminal behavior, while revealing the full extent of his manipulation network and the sophisticated techniques he employed to maintain control over potentially damaging situations. The evidence generated by Marcus's resistance efforts ultimately strengthened the legal case against his manipulation campaign, while providing compelling demonstration of the systematic and calculated nature of his psychological abuse and institutional manipulation. The coordinated attacks on professional witnesses, the legal challenges to evidence, the intimidation tactics, and the continued manipulation of our children created comprehensive documentation of criminal intent that would support successful prosecution while ensuring appropriate protection for our family and other potential victims of his systematic misconduct. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.